Well, the thing to say about Wisdom and Exile is that it's not a book I set out to write. It's not like something that had a clear, coherent structure from the beginning, nor is it really based upon one particular traditional teaching to act as an introduction to it. It's really that I kind of found after a while that there was some material from various sources that I produced that actually did add up to a coherent theme, which is about the encounter of Buddhism with the modern world, with modern times. I mean, it grew from pieces that I'd written for Buddhist magazines like Tricycle, and also from particular standalone presentations I'd given for different centres like Dagpo Kajuling in France, but all adding up to this question of why is there a space for Buddhism in the modern world? What are kind of problems in that kind of encounter between Buddhism and the modern world? And how can we best kind of get hold of the authentic Buddhism in the modern world? And so, like I say, eventually, there was material there that added up to this coherent whole, though I never intended it to be so. So, and then it was suggested that it could be because about 8 chapters, I guess, but it was topped and tailed by somebody's suggestion that I could write a couple of pages about how I met Buddhism in the first place. And then, at the end, I felt I'd go back to that to kind of make it kind of give you a kind of timeless sense, So I tried that, a little bit playing with time and sequences. But essentially, like I say, it starts on that question of, which was asked to me by the people in Dagpo when it was their 40th anniversary or something. They wanted somebody to talk about why is there a space for Buddhism in the West, and that really, in a way, caused me to think a little about the West. Actually, why would anybody be interested? Why has there been an interest in Buddhism in the West in recent decades? And so, in a way, at that point, I had to dig into my kind of original academic education in theology and religious studies, because as I suggest there, in a way, the great hole that exists, I would say, in kind of Western culture has been caused by the kind of evaporation of any sense of kind of coherent spiritual practice and any kind of coherent spiritual view of the world. And for good or ill, I would say that kind of really began at the beginning, in the early modern period with the Reformation and so on. I mean, of course, in a material sense and social sense, many things have improved since that time because of the move away from certain kind of medieval structures. But at the same time, through the rise of Protestantism, particularly, I would say there's been a gradual drying up of any sense of spiritual reality to the world, of any sense there's a spiritual reality that's greater than the merely material. So I do a kind of quick run through that, from Luther and Calvin and the Reformation period through to the so-called Age of Reason and the Age of Enlightenment. And with that, the kind of growth of ideologies that eventually would in a way seem to replace Christianity. Because I guess we're talking about, if I'd written this book in China, it would have a different historical background. But here, the dominant spiritual and intellectual tradition was Christianity. But it's kind of, and this is no criticism of our Christian brothers and sisters, and no sense that they should leave Christianity to become Buddhist. But just speaking at it in a more neutral way, it's kind of very evaporated in power. That is an opportunity for Buddhism, I would say. But at the same time, really, yes, the main dominant ideologies have come to be in a way twofold. One, based upon science, the idea that science answers everything, which one might say is scientism, which is more than the science, you see, and I'll talk about this more later. And at the same time, political ideology, that we can perfect society, we can perfect human beings and society if we develop the right ideology. So I trace that through. And of course, as I go on to say in the succeeding chapters, the ironic thing is that both of these, in a way, are kind of disguised form of Christianity still. So I kind of introduced there why Buddhism has something to say, because it's non-theistic. We can't be, we're alternative to the Christians and the theistic religions that people are familiar with, because we do not say everything comes from a creator. We don't say there's a supreme being in charge of the world. in a way, human beings are in charge of their own destinies. Yeah. Well, they can be in charge of their own destinies. But at the same time, we're not matter. We're not merely matter. We're not merely material machines. There is a spiritual reality to us and to the world which transcends the merely material. And that's, in a way, the key kind of answer of Buddhism, in a way, the main offer of Buddhism to the modern world, that it's non-theistic and based upon reason and experience through meditation and so on, but it doesn't fall into traps of theism, eternalism as we would call it, or nihilism, materialism as we would say. So Buddhism has something really great to offer to the modern world, a tradition which is 2,500 years old, but which is as up to date in a sense of its appeal to reason and experience as anything else, more so I would say. So that should make it really important for the West right now. But then I go on to talk about what, in a way, I just hinted at, which is that the power of these new ideologies have risen in the last few hundred years, science on the one hand and politics as a solution on the other, in a way presents challenges, because many would-be Buddhists, many want to be Buddhists, and I don't use that in a critical sense, you know. Who doesn't want to be a Buddha? But they in a way need to disentangle their thinking from these dominant ideologies, or else there'd be no space for Buddhism to grow in their lives or in the lives of society, in the life of society itself. We're still so enthralled to these dominant ideologies, and as I say, ironically enough, the ghost of Christianity is in those ideologies, and that is because Christianity's view of the world is really a linear view. They inherited it from Jewish tradition, of course. That is, there's a beginning and we're moving forward to an inevitable end of history. Buddhism doesn't think like that. Buddhism teaches impermanence, that all things arise, of course, and cause and conditions and are continually disintegrating, and things rise and fall. Things rise and fall. The only real end is if we actually bring an end to the cause of samsara for us as individuals and become Buddhas. But otherwise, there's just continuation, rise and fall, meeting and parting. So an ideology based upon progress on a first beginning, moving to an end, is incompatible with Buddhism. So things can improve, but things can get worse. And the history of the cosmos, beginning this history, is of rise and fall, things coming and going, empires coming and going, progress happening, decline happening. So we can't buy into this Christian kind of progressivism, which really, in a way, is what animates much science and politics. It doesn't need to, by the way. And that's a point I want to make clear, that science itself is a neutral endeavor to investigate how things in the material world work. And they work through cause and conditions, as we Dharma people say. Not that Buddhism is science or science is Buddhism, but just that simple kind of scientific praxis is entirely compatible with Dharma, as long as it is not used for immoral ends. But scientism, the idea that science can answer everything and that science will solve all problems, is a kind of, in a way, is an ideological imposition on scientific practice. And that's what leads people to say, well, we're all machines, there's no consciousness, and so on, which is, of course, impossible, because consciousness cannot arise from the non-conscious, cannot arise from the accidents of matter. So I point that out, and I point out because particularly many Buddhists, in a way, are entangled in this because they haven't really thought through how Buddhism is strikingly different from modern ideologies as well as from Christianity. So scientism, we're not interested in Buddhism. Scientific practice, we're fine with, if I could say in that kind of rather presumptuous way. But I also mentioned that I think that attempts to prove Buddhism right by scientific experiments is a dreary, utter misconception. You can monitor your brain waves as long as you like. You can monitor your stomach turbulence as long as you like. And maybe when you meditate, you have less stomach turbulence. And maybe your brain waves are slightly slower. But it doesn't add up to anything. It doesn't lead you anywhere near enlightenment. Jetson Milarepa didn't know anything about that and became enlightened. So forgive me, but I think that kind of proof of Buddhism is a betrayal of Dharma, and philosophically illiterate and confused. And then I talk a bit about politics, because again, many Western Buddhists haven't really thought through this, that Buddhism can't be mapped onto Western ideological concepts, which, as I say, whether it's communism, fascism, ecology, you name it, right wing, left wing, the rest, they are still animated by the ghost of Christian progressivism, that we're moving towards a promised land. Yes, it's not now the second coming of Christ. It's the 1,000-year Reich, or the communist superstate, or whatever it is. But those nothing to do with us in Dharma. They only have a meaning in terms of decayed Christian culture, and we don't believe in them anyway, because everything that comes about ends. So we got to disinfect Buddhism from any prior political preconceptions. Should we not engage in politics? Oh, maybe we should, because maybe we should look after our neighborhood. After all, everything is interdependent. So we have, in a way, a duty to others and a duty to the world to care for it and to look after it. But not with these demented ideologies of modern times. That's what I would say. So a Buddhist can engage in politics, but should do so in a modest way and not an ideological way, putting the welfare of others, the welfare of their beings first, and not trying to reshape the world according to some ideological scheme. The world will always resist that anyway. So I discussed that in there, pointing out that there's no package of ideological a prioris that Buddhism can sign up to. We don't even want a Buddhist, I would say, we shouldn't even want a Buddhist political party either. Sometimes Buddhists have ruled societies, and Buddhists, like everybody else, apart from Buddhas, are deluded by disturbing emotions. So there's no perfectible society. They're perfectible individuals, and that's what we should be working on, but no perfect society. So if we are called upon to have political responsibility, whether it's as a local councillor, or even perhaps, Buddha help them, presidents and kings, we should be modest and in our aims and careful in our actions. And I point out that, Buddha himself counseled both republics and monarchies in his day in India, because both forms of politics existed at that time. He didn't issue a preference for either, but he was kind and helpful in giving advice. The same with our great Sakya masters like Chojo Pakpa, who became the guru to an advisor of Kublai Khan and was able to modify some of the worst parts of the kind of social and political practices of the time. So it's not that Buddhists should step out and kind of opt out and drop out of responsibility, but that they should do so they should engage from a truly Buddhist perspective, which is not going to map onto modern political ideologies, particularly as many of them have moral policies, which are utterly at odds with the Buddhist view of what is the nature of life. So I talk about that. And then I go on to talk about the fact that, to continue the same point, we should divest ourselves of our assumptions when we encounter Buddhism, or else we will not see it. We will imagine that Buddhism is just identical with our own ideological background. For us who came to Buddhism in the late 60s and early 70s, I think that's a particular issue, because many of us came imagining that Buddhism was more or less the same as a continuation of the so-called alternative society or the beat hippie kind of thing. And it takes quite a while to unpack that and to start to respond to Buddhism freshly, to listen to what Buddha actually is saying rather than what we imagine he's saying. So I talk about that in the chapters as a conceit, as I call it, and disillusionment, because I think part of that not unpacking our assumptions has led to confusion and disappointment with the actual encounter with Dharma. And then I talk about how we can really make use of Dharma by learning the craft, as I say, meeting properly qualified masters, and hearing, thinking, meditating, listening without bias and prejudice, thinking, analysing, using our reason, our common sense, to take the teachings apart to see if they really work, and then developing experience through meditation. And I go on to say a little bit more about meditation, because, again, there's certain kind of modernist kind of takes on meditation, trying to divorce meditation from Buddhism and so on, which really in a way one might think, oh, this will popularize Buddhism if we do that. We miss out all the difficult Buddhist stuff and then we get lots of recruits. But I think that's a betrayal of Dharma, and also I think we'll betray those people because it won't lead to anything particularly positive for them. And then I talk about compassion. I have a chapter called Wise Compassion, which again is like, what do you think, like these are modern assumptions about compassion in the Western Buddhist world and so on. And this is what Buddha really taught about it. And we might really develop an intelligent compassion rather than sentimental compassion. Because that's so often the big destructive factor, that we can't separate sentiment from compassion. Sentiment is really about me. How I feel. I'm such a good person because I do this. Compassion is all about other. And so often the two have been confused in the Western takes and the Western presentations of Buddhism. Buddha was a clear-sighted, clear-thinking being. He cut through the evasions of self-interest, which that are there in kind of fake compassion, sentimental compassion, and that's what I try to follow through in this chapter on wise compassion. So in a way, the Wisdom and Exile it's a gentle book. Some people may think it's a little combative. There's no guilty names mentioned in the book. I don't attack anybody. But it's just like, well, it's a bit vain and presumptuous, but the great masters such as Sakipandita in the 12th and 13th century, and Patra Rinpoche in the 9th century, many great masters from time to time had to point out, well, these are errors that have crept into the discourse on Buddhism, these errors that have crept into the practice of Buddhism. So we need to kind of, to have the real thing, to keep the medicine really working, the medicine of Dharma, we need to kind of get rid of some of this stuff, where we need to point out that it's contradictory. In a very minor way, I'm trying to do the same in Wisdom and Exile. So it's not meant to be offensive or to be critical of other people, but I just want people to have the chance I did, which is to meet the real teachings. Because I was so fortunate to meet great masters. Some of them are still living, of course, and hear that, and fortunately able to eventually hear the Dharma as it was really being spoken, rather than through the filter of my own post-hippie kind of preconceptions. So that's what Wisdom in Exile. And the title, well, isn't wisdom always in exile? As we say, the Buddha nature is in all sentient beings, even though they're covered over by the disturbing emotions and ignorance. And isn't wisdom particularly in exile in the modern world, the world which thinks it's so smart because of its nuclear bombs and experimental laboratories destroying human life, but is actually very stupid? Isn't wisdom in exile here?